Guys, we have Ali Salman with us today. He is the founder and the managing trustee of Prime Institute, Policy Research for Market Economy. It's a think tank based in Islamabad. It's actually where I first entered my professional career life. I'm not sure if Ali knows because he was in Malaysia back then. So मेरा उनसे direct उस वक्त इतना interaction नहीं हुआ. But that's where I formally started my professional career. He's also the co-founder and the CEO of Islam and Liberty Network, which is a global platform for researchers and academics, and they promote a Muslim case for freedom, is how Ali likes to put it. इसके अलावा Ali has been involved with think tanks, the government, the private sector, social enterprises. He's been doing a lot of stuff over the past 20 or so years. I'm going to give the floor to Ali to formally begin the session.
Thank you so much, Asra, and very pleased to see at least virtually all of you in this Learners Republic session. I think Learners Republic is doing a great job by bringing together different scholars from different field, and not just scholars but also practitioners, and now also reaching out to young students and young professionals. And I think this is the way to do it. How do you spread knowledge? So I'm very pleased to be part of it, and thank you to the Friends at Learners Republic to create this opportunity. So I'm going to talk about Islam and economic liberty today. I plan to talk for about 45 minutes, and then I will hopefully have an interactive discussion session with all of you. Before I come to the topic, which is on Islam and economic liberties, I'm going to sort of explain my understanding of what is economic liberty first, because this can mean different things to different people. And I think it's only fair if I could offer a definition. For me, the economic freedom or economic liberty, I'm using liberty and freedom interchangeably in this presentation, is essentially a freedom to persuade your economic goals, the choice of your economic profession, without any coercion, without any obstacles. Now, the moment I say this, obviously, one can also relate it that this cannot be sort of a black and white thing. You cannot have no freedom, or you cannot have absolute level of freedom. It will be always a spectrum. But essentially, economic liberty is the ability, and not just the ability, but also the freedom to pursue the goals. Now, the obstacles to freedom or economic liberty can come in essentially in two forms. One is sort of more direct obstacle. For instance, if government declares tomorrow that it's going to run all the pharmacies in the country, and no private sector or entrepreneur is allowed to run pharmacy, it means that in that sector, by a decree of a law, the government has banned the entry of private individuals, so there is no economic freedom left in that sector. Similarly, there is there could be a situation where there are indirect obstacles to economic liberties. Now, government may not say anything to stop the entry of private sector, let's say in the pharmacy business, but it can impose very high level of taxation, and if someone is involved in trading, it can impose very high level of tariffs, or introduce laws or regulations which make doing business very difficult. So there are various forms where you can actually limit the degree of economic freedom available to individuals and to entrepreneurs and to organizations. Um, and so I think it relates to the role of the government and influence of the government in so many ways. And it sometimes, if a private sector group or individual is given monopoly by the law, it can also lead to restrictions of economic freedom available to others. So that's how I understand economic liberty broadly defined. Now, the second part of the presentation of the topic is Islam here. Now, as we all will appreciate, this is even far more complex than the notion of economic liberty. Already, there is no one definition of economic liberty. And similarly, there is no one understanding of Islam. And this has been done for centuries, interpretations, understanding of what is Islam has varied with individuals, and with scholars have done a lot of work in this domain. So with all humbleness and humility, I'm going to make a disclaimer that what I'm going to lay out today in this presentation on Islamic and economic freedom is essentially how I understand the message or the principles of economic organization as laid out by Islam. Now, quickly, when I say Islam in this presentation, I am referring to mostly classical understanding and practice. So we know that Quran is the main source of Islamic knowledge, and we also know that the sayings of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his practice, the Sunnah, constitutes the other important pillar of Islam. And then also the practices by the first four caliphs. So this is the classical understanding of Islam, how it evolved in initial part of the history. But obviously, it's a live religion followed by billions, and then therefore even today the interpretations are being subject to different kind of understanding. So that's the these are the two pillars of my presentation: Islam and economic liberty. Now, a fair question is, does actually Islam offer any distinct economic framework or economic principles at all, or is it more of a set of moral principles? For instance, do not steal money, do justice in your dealing, be fair to consumer. These are the moral principles of commercial transactions. And so are we talking about these moral principles only, or are we talking about certain functional principles of economic organization? And I would like to argue that while the foundation of many of these principles are moral, we are essentially talking about practical and functional aspects of economic organization, which we can use in day-to-day economic life, and we can use in actually defining economic policies for that matter. Obviously, the details of these policies, when it comes to regulations, is quite open and subject to human effort. But my point is that the main pillars of or main principles of economic organization have been defined broadly in Islam. And there are various aspects to it. I'm going to mostly focus on the economic liberty today, because this is one topic which I think has not been addressed adequately by the subject we know as Islamic economics. So Islamic economics in my presentation book, I use to refer to the standard academic work which is being produced all over the world in hundreds of universities as a discipline which emerged in last 100 years. And that has mainly focused, it has remained focused on a couple of things really. First, as we know, is the main top, like the most popular topic is the issue of banking and interest and riba, and a lot more other discussion has happened on the sort of redistribution of resources. And to me, this is a very narrow focus, and Islam as a religion has offered broader principles of economic organization, and just limiting ourselves to the issue of banking and riba or redistribution doesn't do justice to the whole framework here. So in my research, I have tried to gone beyond these issues and try to explore policies of economic organization. I would also like to acknowledge the work, the support which was extended to me by a US-based institute called Acton Institute, which has invited me to give some lectures in their university, and then also later this year, inshallah, I'll be publishing a small book on the same subject, Islam and its economic framework. So today's presentation is largely based on that publication. Let me quickly now go through some slides with you just for structuring my discussion here. I'm going to spend some time on principles, but really I'm going to spend more time on the functional and operative framework of the economic organization. So let me open up the slide here. I can share the screen. I hope it is now visible.
Yes, Ali, it is.
So this is a quote from a book which was published about 4 years ago, Early Islam and the Birth of Capitalism by Benedict Coiler. And he said, I'm quoting, Muhammad gave his community, along with the new religion, a new framework for the economy. Muhammad's economic policy promoted entrepreneurial initiative, efficient distribution of resources, a framework for wealth creation that lasted for centuries. In this book, he has discovered and introduced some of these aspects of the history of the economic organization in Islam, which was, I think, which has not been done quite extensively by Muslim scholars themselves. So it's quite interesting to have a look at this book. As I said, principles going to there are three principles I find based which can be derived from the sources of Islamic knowledge. First is the principle of ownership, and then principle of wealth creation and wealth circulation. Now, in a nutshell, the principle of ownership divides the property in two spheres. One is the public property, which sometimes is understood as state-owned, and sometimes it is understood as the owned by community. So state ownership and community ownership together as public property. And a second broad division is private property. And I refer to a hadith which says that water, fire, and grass belong to the community, and there are events in Prophet's life which are consistent with this saying. Sometimes these essential resources which should be public, available to the public and community, may not be actually put in a private property, but their use, their distribution can be done through private hands under the arrangement with the community or the state. So the broader principles which the Islamic scholars have derived from these discussions is naturally occurring resources which are there without any human effort should belong to in the public ownership, whether under the community or under the state. Whereas the assets which are created or developed as a result of human effort remain under the private property. And then there is no limit to how much you can own, whether in terms of land or the agricultural property or your commercial factories. But the fine point here, as we learn from the principles from the history, is that it's not that you can own a land absolutely, let's say, without using it. If you are owning a land, but you are not using it productively, then that private ownership or private property can be taken back. So there's this like a third dimension perhaps to the property, which while the private property is acknowledged, but then it's also acknowledged that you cannot just keep it without being useful for the society at large. And then it's a very important principle, principle of wealth creation, which is essentially coming from voluntary trade and savings. And then there is, again, we see no upper limit, for instance, defined on how much wealth, on how much profit can be made in our businesses, but there are general encouragement to create more wealth. At the same time, there is also a principle of wealth creation, and importantly, the rights of other people have been defined in your wealth. So this is again different from traditional concept of property rights, in which I'm saying that I am the owner of 100% of my own property, but then the Islamic economic frameworks prescribes rights for others in the property which you own. So again, there is this element of public needs or social protection within the private property, which is ingrained in these principles. Now, let me spend some more time on the framework itself, the operational and the institutional framework of the system. These are the 8 tenets, in my view, which define this framework. And on the top, I have put here, as you can see, price freedoms. This is quite central to everything else we're going to discuss. As we know that prices are essentially the most important indicator in the economic life in general. So do we have a clear instruction either in Quran or in Hadith literature on price control? Or are traders free to exercise their prices they want? So there are events in Prophet life. There's no explicit direction in Quran, but there are events in Prophet's life in which it is narrated that when prices rose in Medina, when Prophet Muhammad also had acquired the status as the ruler of the city, the people came to Prophet and complained and asked him to fix the prices. And he refused to fix the prices. And actually he invoked the principle of justice here, and I'm quoting the hadith here, which you can see: Allah is the one who fixes prices, who withholds, gives lavishly, and provides. And I hope that when I meet Allah, none of you will have any claim on me for an injustice regarding blood or property. So that is the consistent policy. But at the same time, we also have hadiths which condemns and prohibits hoarding, and especially hoarding of food stock. And there has been rich discussion on the like on one hand we have price freedom, but on the other hand we have hoarding. We have condemnation of hoarding. And how they are linked was actually shown by the practice of caliphs, and particularly Caliph Umar, who, when approached the issue of when he actually he was the first inspector in our sense, a market inspector. But when he was caliph, and then he came to know about hoarding practices, he established that he used to force the traders to release the goods, but still not fix the price, so that the flow of the goods is maintained without actually violating the basic principle of price freedom. That's very important to understand, that there is a strong element of consumer protection in this framework. And actually, as you can see, the terms of reference or mandate of the market inspector, the institution of Hisba, are very well defined. This is all coming from historical documents. And as you can, if you read through this: inspection, ensuring integrity of contracts, and forbidding certain type of price discrimination is all checked, is all controlled. For instance, there was a practice in that time when the traders used to come from outside the city. The shopkeepers or traders inside the city were used to intercept the caravan, the trade caravan coming from, let's say, Syria or Yemen, outside the city limit, and then and make deals. And Prophet actually stopped this practice and saying that this is unfair to the incoming trade caravan, because the caravan would not know the demand of that goods in the city, and unfair to the city residents who would not know what's coming. And he said all the transaction is going to happen in the market, which he established soon after he established the masjid, the mosque. As soon as he established the market, this physical boundary in the city, the existing tribes, the Jewish tribes in particular, resisted that. And it, according to history, 3 or 4 times that market was stopped from functioning. But then Muslims prevailed, and then eventually their market was established. And the first thing which Prophet Muhammad announced, that there will be no fees, there will be no tariff in my market, in this market of Muslims. So eventually it gave some kind of advantage also to the new community of believers. But then also he was establishing certain practices and boundaries for economic transactions in the future. So we learned that not only he was against price control, but he was also not in favor of tariffs. Later on, in subsequent time, Muslim rulers did introduce tariff, and that's like a part of the history, from let's say 10% to even it went up to very high to 50% in later centuries. But then it was always understood that this stops trade, and this is, we should keep it at a minimum level if we want. Now the other, I think, part of this framework of economic liberty is actually interesting in my view. It's not directly about business freedom. It's about the role of the government. You would recall that when I was initially setting up the definition of economic freedom or economic liberty, I refer to the role of the government, and which is directly proportional to the size of the government, which ultimately is directly proportional to the taxes which it collects. So there was an interesting article last year by the Turkish historian Timur Kuran on the history of zakat. And according to Quran, in Timur Quran, zakat was not just an ibadah, but also it was used as a transaction law, and it directly helped in keeping the size of the government. And although he laments that this could have been used as a principle for subsequent successive Islamic governments to actually limit its size, but it was not actually practiced. But he just made it a point that zakat and the other tax which is on the land use together, because it's a low and flat rate, so it defines how much the government can earn on taxes. Now again, in terms of practice, it didn't happen this way. So in terms of practice, Muslim governments actually also depend on on war income, for instance. So there were other sources of income available, but I'm here talking about the main principles and how they evolved and how they can be applied today. Then the other aspects of this framework is the financing and as I said, the monetary aspect of it. I'm not going to spend too much time here. This goes a bit beyond my topic today, Islamic on economic liberty. But I'm taking more of this view, which is present in the book by Muhammad Akram Khan, who wrote a book a few years back, What is Wrong with Islamic Economics, in which he is maintaining distinction between financing and a cash-based transaction, essentially maintaining a difference between riba, which is prohibited, and interest, which is, of course, as we know in different names, is practiced in Islamic banks as of today. Again, a very important sort of feature of this system is the use of currency. What kind of currency does Islam recommends, if any? Now, as compared with other aspects which I have discussed, there is no explicit direction in terms of which kind of currency Islam would recommend, either in Quran or in Hadith for that matter. But we can derive from certain laws and practices, especially from Caliph Umar, that Islam may have a preference of a gold-backed currency over a fiat currency. And reason is that in my view, the fiat currency, which obviously depends on how the government, the value which the government would hold, and it directly depends on the strength of a government. A currency backed by gold would have its own parameter and is not directly depend on the political force of a government, which I think is more closer to a system which is just and is not dependent on a particular system. We also know, for instance, holding of gold is not permissible, and that is also related with the fact that gold was used even in that time, earlier time, as a medium of exchange. And that's something which certainly needs more research. There have been efforts in recent times to go in that direction. So Islam prefers a gold-backed currency over fiat. And again, how it is related with economic freedom? Well, when the government is printing money, which happens quite frequently, what it is doing that on its own sweet will, it is reducing the purchasing power of the citizens. In other words, it is reducing the goods, it is reducing the number of goods which currency in our pockets, in our wallets can buy. So this is essentially a reduction in economic freedom of the citizens. And therefore, perhaps preference should be made to a gold-backed currency in which these artificial measures can be minimized. And as we know that until 1971, actually this was the case all over the world. And then we switched to dollar from 1971 onwards. Again, an aspect which I discuss in my book, but I'm not going to spend too much time on in this presentation. But I think one aspect is important is that institution of, excuse me. Now, sorry. Again, Waqf is a voluntary, permanent, and irrevocable dedication of a portion of one's own wealth. So it is your private property, and you waqf, or you dedicate the use of that property for a particular cause. It is directly related with economic liberty. It is directly related with private property. And once the waqf is created, the government actually cannot take it back for generations and for centuries. This was the first waqf was created by Prophet Muhammad himself, following an example of a Jewish tribe whom he saw practicing a waqf for a well for drinking water. So he encouraged that practice, that for social needs of society, you actually can dedicate a portion of your wealth, also for your family. So there are different purposes for family, for society. And interestingly, this institution of waqf, there's like more research being done around the world today, was widely practiced throughout Islamic history till the time of colonization, when the Muslims lost political power, and then those properties were taken by the government, and after these countries, like different part of the world, in different part of the world, gain freedom from the colonial powers and masters, unfortunately, that element of private property which was already part of state, never came back to the society. It remained with the state. And therefore, it again, I think it's a major driver. It was a major driver of economic liberty, which the state took over, firstly by the colonial powers and then by the national governments. According to one research, as late as in Ottoman Empire, in 19th century, almost, according to some accounts, 2/3, and according to some accounts, 75% of land was actually under some kind of a waqf. 75% is huge, and they use the waqf for not just charitable purpose and not just for religious purposes or for establishing mosque. They were using it for loans for businesses, microfinance to be precise. And so there were all kind of socio-economic usage of the waqf property. So what was happening? It was people own wealth. They were doing it. They were allocating a part of their wealth for their family and also for the society, which was an important institution throughout the Islamic history. But we lost it to the state power. So I'm coming to a close of my presentation. I've offered a few principles earlier, the 3 principles, and then the 8 institutional tenets of the system: price freedom, free trade, strong business regulations, sound currency, riba-free banking, low and flat taxes, voluntary contributions, and inheritance distribution, which I did not address. But I believe that they are these principles even today can be applied in reforming the economic organization of our society and remain quite relevant. I mean, look at the big issue of price control. We have price magistrate, we have price controlling authorities. We're doing more harm for the consumer at the end of the day, but also definitely for the producer than anything else. So we can talk about that aspect. We can talk about the idea of a limited government if zakat was taken as a tax. We can talk about waqf as an institution which was based on respect of private property, but then has a very strong social element to it. And therefore, this case that Islam and economic liberty go hand in hand, and this is a system which is not just important for wealth creation, but in my humble opinion, also follows the principles of justice which Islam has offered. I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to have discussions or comments or questions on this.
Thank you so much, Ali, for such an insightful session. We're going to take questions now. So as always, raise your hand and ask away. Abdul Rahman.
Assalamu alaikum, sir. Thank you for the session. So my question is, how can we implement Islamic economic framework when on the baseline we are running our country on interest-based loans?
Yeah, so that's what I was saying earlier, that we have focused our attention on perhaps which is the most complex part of our economy today. And if I were to make a policy based on these principles for the economic organization, I would not start from interest. Okay. I would start from something more fundamental. I would start from the issues of wealth creation. I would start from issues of social protection. But coming back to the issue of interest, I think there's like a lot of work already done in this field, and I am of the view that Islamic finance and Islamic banks, which have evolved, which implicitly acknowledge and use the principle of interest, is a step in the right direction. And although there are very strong voices against Islamic banks within the Islamic theory today on economics, but I remain of the view that I think this is one example where we have seen ijtihad being applied. And these institutions are already showing us a way out of it. Look, the whole idea when even the banks, you may be aware that the uh, the element of usury or exploitative rates of return were also condemned by all religious texts. Right? So they were condemned by Bible, by Torah, and by all religions. Um, but how the banks were evolved, one part of the history of the banks evolution was that they evolved in trying to control, or not control really, of an alternative to the exploitative money lending practices, very high rates. So we have in our society, for instance, please do not mind if I say Pathan's rate, because it's part of the social practices. So we know in our society it still happens. And even friends, I think that microfinance as practiced in many parts of the world today, microfinance is very exploitative in terms of the rates it offers. It is exploitative. It is more exploitative than normal commercial banks. So
So, sir,
it
what's the
can
way?
qualify that.
Sorry.
So my point is that already we are finding the way out. I mean, these Islamic banks, Islamic finance are offering a way out, but it's not a completely way out. But we have to come out from, this is a matter of understanding. We have to come out from this sort of I think this notion that all Islamic banks are haram. There are very strong voices which says that. So if we can come up, if we can accept the evolution of Islamic banks as a legitimate development, then we have an answer. But if we do not accept it, but then it's a different story.
Thank you, sir.
Uh, Sadori, you can ask your question. Maruf, you also had your hand raised, but now you don't.
My question was related to Islamic banking, which Ali Salman did answer. So that's why I
Okay.
lowered my hand.
Okay, fair enough. Sadori, you can ask your question.
Okay, thank you, Asra. So thank you for the session, sir. So आपने एक बात की थी about certain things being states property like natural resources and others being private. So in that context, health and education pay, what would that look like in a Islamic economy, and especially when you talk about not regulating prices? So how do you see healthcare in that context?
Right, it's a very good question. So in terms of there are possibly two answers or two aspects to this question. One is that I think if we go for by the practice, the institution of Waqf, which I elaborated, was used as a social welfare principle. But even in the very start of Islamic history, the state was providing the essential services, particularly in health, and the revenue which it was getting, not just from zakat, because it had traditional usages, but also from Baitul Mal, from other contributions, was being done by the state. So I am of the view that we need to operate both Waqf as a private property, and also employ the role of the state in delivering these services, especially when it comes to basic primary education, school education. But really, I'm now coming out of the sort of very strict notion of what was originally was established as part of the Islamic history, and this is our own interpretation. I think we know that the state played an important role in provision of basic services, food security, and health, and later on, people from their own wealth established institutions which then contributed in maintaining health and education for everyone.
Thank you, sir. Asra, may I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Um, Sir, I wanted to know a bit more about sources on Islamic economic history, because whatever as students we know is by and large dominated by one predominant view of the economic organization under Islam, which is sort of free market, a kind of a capitalist. I refrain from using these umbrella terms. However, there is this alternative discourse of Islamic socialism, for example. And where do we hear stories like, Abu Zar Ghafari rebelling against the Usmania Caliphate when it came to, hoarding property and accumulation of wealth. So, resources, and secondly, your opinion on what Islamic socialism is. Are there enough Quranic provisions to support this ideology?
Right. I think this is again a very important and insightful question. Look, of course, we have used these terms for our own convenience. I mean, we have used the word, I mean, I did not use the word Islamic capitalism for that matter, although some commentators do use it. And similarly, people have used the word Islamic socialism. And in our own political history, Pakistan People's Party was founded on this very principle, the Islamic socialism principle. So it's like, in a way, this understanding has affected our economics and our society to a deeper degree, certainly. So what I would like to, I think, in terms of the source, the sources, it's an understanding of the history. If yes, we have the example of Abu Zar Ghafari. You correctly pointed out that he was more for like distribution and more equality, but I think predominantly there is an encouragement for wealth creation, for wealth generation, for Muslims are encouraged to be strong financially. I would not use the word capitalism and socialism, because then it would, I think, restrict our understanding of the economic principles in the light of Islam. But perhaps one important element of sort of a distinction which may help you is the conception of private property. Now, in the free market capitalism, as we understand today, the protection of private property is absolute, is central to everything else. And so it extends to even, let's say, the natural resources, right? Although, of course, now we know that there is this strong contestation on this idea, and the community ownership, the idea is well recognized in the economics literature. But in the pure form of capitalism, there's like private property, but the principles which I have laid down earlier today actually do not recognize the absolute notion of private property. There is a distinction between the type of property. And crudely speaking, I would say that there is an element of socialism. When I said water and fire and grass belong to the community, right? So I was quoting a hadith. So people would say, oh, this is actually socialism, because you're saying these parts of our life cannot be owned by the private hands, which is the principle which I described. But then I'm saying, on the other hand, that there is the factories and the agriculture produce the livestock, which are produced as a result of human effort. There is no limit to the ownership of that property. So that you can say, oh, this is not socialism now. This is like you are encouraging concentration of wealth. So you cannot actually, I think you cannot say, you cannot use the words Islamic capitalism or Islamic socialism without running into the risk of reductionism. I think both are reductionist.
I agree.
Both conceptions are reductionist. And I would hesitate to take I would hesitate to use these words.
It's just that I don't know, the Islamic economic system, that phrase is interchangeably used with capitalism, and that is something I find problematic. But your presentation does a very good job of pointing out the nuances. So thank you very much for that. We have more questions, Asra.
Ahmed, go ahead, ask your question.
Thank you, Ali, for an excellent presentation. So I want your view on Waqf a bit more. So I was reading the work of Taimur Quran and then few other authors, and they highlight that Waqf played an important role in the provision of public goods in early Islamic society. And it was transformative in that sense. But then it also, or some of the other books, they also go on to mention that later on, like after 200 or so years, there was a lot of abuse of it, in the sense of people started to, let's say, classify their wealth or put their wealth in waqf, which sort of gave them a protection from taxes. And essentially, another element of waqf was essentially when you say that the waqf is allocated for providing XYZ, then forever it has to be XYZ, which essentially means there's lack of flexibility when it comes to the allocation or reallocation of resources later on when the society changes. And this sort of links to Fatma's question as well, that perhaps later on the same institution, which was very well suited to an early environment when it came to the public provision of when it came to the provision of public goods, later on was abused by the elites of that time to avoid taxes and to just live a life of their own. And then we sort of see some sort of parallels to that happening in today's world as well, where you've got all of these billionaires investing or putting their money in trusts and then essentially living off whatever is coming out of their trust income. So how do you see? So this is obviously the story told to us by Taimur Quran and some other people. So what are your views on this aspect of it?
Yeah, no, I think this is an important this is an important argument used against the evolution of Waqf by Taimur Quran and others. I do acknowledge, but there are like competing authors, competing interpretations of the same phenomena, which have offered this explanation that while the Waqf provided for protection of private property, it was also being used by for extending socioeconomic benefit. But I think on one point there is some element of truth there, that of course it also introduced the element of rigidity. The state could not do much with that part of the property which was held in Waqf. So yes, I think I do acknowledge that there is a nuance there on the institution, and perhaps there is more research needed. But my view is that even if this is the case, let's say if applied today, and if you remember, so one of the things I said initially was whether your own property was being used productively or not. So there was this practice of cancellation of lease or like ownership when the agriculture property given by the state to someone was not being used or harvested. So and I think that's why perhaps there is an element of the social needs, and then one can use that to apply to the modern times.
Thank you.
Javeria, you can ask your question.
Assalamu alaikum, sir. Thank you for your presentation. There was a slide in your presentation which was discussing something related to currency and gold. So please elaborate a little bit on more that. And I was just wondering that it came into my mind that did the Bretton Woods system, that which was Bretton Woods 1, when all currencies were defined in relation to dollar and dollar itself was converted into gold. Did Bretton Woods system took some of its inspiration from that thing? Thank you.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I have not read anywhere if the Bretton Woods system took an inspiration from this history, but I essentially base my view on the understanding of certain principles, and essentially I've created or compared two types of currencies: fiat currency and the gold-backed currency. In my view, gold-backed currency offers more stability in the system and creates less room for a central bank or a central government to take away our purchasing power. So that's why I think I prefer the gold-backed currency. This is also consistent with the Austrian economics, as we know, as we understand today. So Austrian economics is also for a gold-backed currency. I think there is a strong relationship between this view and modern notions of Austrian economics, which is against the idea of central bank having the ability. So this goes like this. I think that this goes deeper than just financial management. This goes to the very element of the which institution controls the economic transactions.
Thank you so much, Ali. Uh, do we have any more questions? I
There was
think
a comment. I can read a comment, but I cannot understand this comment. There was a little tough for me by Arusa. Can you explain that?
Rusa.
Rusa,
Rusa is our
do you?
medical doctor from Karachi. So,
Oh,
yes. So we have a lot of diversity, sir, here in this cohort. A lot of students from science background. I do have a question
okay.
for you from a fellow. So this is posted anonymously. What does Islam say about women's economic participation?
Interesting. Yeah, that's again a sensitive question, but we have learned from our history that Islam established the rights of women in the inheritance at the time and in the property at the time when women were given no rights in the inheritance. And I think that so that is important to realize. Although in today in our contemporary Pakistani society, at least, unfortunately, many of these rights which are available for women through inheritance are denied plainly by the society, by the practice, which is quite unfortunate. And secondly, if you it's not just about the law, but if you go to the history, I mean, look at Prophet's life himself. He married Khadija, Razila Ta'ala Anha, and she was, of course, as we know, a very successful merchant. And so we have this a reading of that society in which women were quite active in social and economic life of the society, which is very unlike today's, at least Pakistan, unfortunately, where women do not participate or are not allowed to participate in the public sphere for one reason or another other reason, which I find absolutely not consistent with Islam and even contemporary Islamic societies like even look at Iran, Malaysia, for instance, Bangladesh. The economic participation of women in or in social spheres is huge.
Thank you, Ali. I had another question actually. It is about the ownership principles related to ownership that you identified, where natural resources are public property under Islam. Now, considering all the really staggering information that I come across about capitalists buying off water bodies, because in future that would be it already is a kind of a commodity. Um, Why do we not hear enough agitation or angst from some of the Islamic groups, not just locally in Pakistan, but internationally, from Islamic scholars? This is one of those oft forgotten topics, but I think this requires a spotlight of its own.
Yeah, no, I'm happy that you mentioned it. You brought a new aspect, but this is true. This is happening, and I think, to be very honest with you, before I actually myself got more educated, I was over the years I have read this was literature. I was of the view that natural resources, even water, can be privatized. But I changed my view after coming across the evidence and also this discussion which you mentioned, but also these principles. And I think why it is not part of the debate is is primarily because the Islamic scholars, especially the scholars of Islamic economics, have very narrowly focused on issues of money and banking, and that's really it. 80% of the literature under this subject is about that, and so there is hardly, well, I would not say hardly. There is very little attention on the principles. So if you go to the principles of the, let's say, the property of the economic organization, I'm sure these things will come up because uh, this hadith itself, which I quoted, is well known. It's not an obscure hadith. It is well known in the literature. It's a Sahih hadith, and then people can access it easily. But I think um using this insight in a broader framework which relates to the policy challenges of today's is something else, and that's probably needs to happen a lot more, and I hope that this work is a small contribution towards that understanding. But I totally agree, there is hardly any discussion by applying these principles on the contemporary challenges. In this case, the environment is crucial.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Salman. Unless we have any more questions, I would very much like to hoard his time for my own, but we have we have another anonymous question. It is about leveraging economic policy, economics, and Islam for foreign policy, like what was done in the Cold War. So, do you think today that could be done with regards to trade wars between America and China? Where I think she means that China supports free trade today and America is putting tariffs, at least under Trump. So, can China
Yeah,
really leverage and form those kinds of alliances in the Middle East, perhaps trade alliances and
yeah, it's very interesting. And of course, this is not related with the theology or theory of Islamic economics. This is a very geostrategic question. So I'm going to um, share my view very freely in that sense. Well, I mean, my view is that like historically, the notion of free trade has evolved through different nations, and from the repeal of corn laws in UK 200 years ago to the disputes on intellectual property between USA and China. We have seen these positions being changed with the time, and these nations have evolved their positions. And you're right that at least under Trump, the world, the US at least, and then not just US, but also many European countries move towards more inward-looking policies, and China became more open. Um, and it continues to be so. I think it's an exciting times in what we are witnessing in our lifetime. How the China, which was once a home ground of socialism and communism, and to some extent it is, has become a advocate for free trade and America or USA, which was really the home ground of free trade, has been now talking about protectionism at home and at abroad. Yeah, but I'm not sure if I can apply, because of course none of these countries openly ascribe anything to do with the Islamic principles. But it's like one sort of slightly a digression. It's really a digression, but maybe an interesting one. So you have heard about the supply side economics. You might have heard about Arthur Laffer through his Laffer curve. The idea that if you increase the tax rates, ultimately the tax collection goes down, and he has described this insight, which becomes the very basic foundation of supply side economics to the Muslim scholar and sociologist and historian Ibn Khaldun, who lived through 12th century. And so there is I think this transfer of civilizational knowledge which has been occurring, but many times it has not been acknowledged in its due place. As I said, this is a digression.
Thank you very much, sir, for answering all the questions and for your excellent presentation. We enjoyed it a lot. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Asra and Fatma, and all of you who have joined. And I hope that you're taking something useful from this session. I'll be happy to share my presentation with all of you. I'll share the presentation file with Asra, and she can share. And hopefully, in a couple of months' time.
Ali, during some of our earlier conversations, you mentioned you would like the fellows to read some of the articles that you've written. So, agar aap wo bhi bhej dein, I'll circulate it with the team as well.
I will do that. Certainly. I'm still holding for the publication of this book, which is expected in a few weeks' time. But I'm happy to share the articles nevertheless.
Sure.
If we may know the title so that we can pre-order.
Title is Islam and Economics, Markets, Moral and Justice.
Oh, fantastic.
We'll keep an eye out on that for that one.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, everyone.